Hi everyone, welcome back to our reader's blog reading time with Pickle. Um, we are currently reading Asylum by Madeleine Roux, and I was thinking over a few things, and maybe I've been a bit tough on this book so far. Um, I was just kind of looking over it and again, rather, and we're not even a third of the way through, and I am making a lot of judgment and criticism as to character development, pacing, etc., etc. But let's keep in mind we're at around the 30% mark. Um, I am hoping that things will pick up and we will have a lot more development to come. Again, one of my biggest gripes that I hope we will see some improvement is that the characters to me seem quite bland. So far, we're going to start. We've read the first 10 chapters. Daniel has had interactions with maybe only 4 or 5 different characters, which is fine. But the extent of these interactions, in my opinion, is quite shallow. With his roommate Felix, really there hasn't been too much interaction. Felix is just kind of there on the periphery as always. With his friend Abby, other than Abby being a love interest, we don't know too much, and having some family life with her parents possibly on the hinge of getting divorced. We don't know really too much about Abby. She's just kind of generic, and really more than anything, what's emphasized about her, which is kind of annoying to me, is how just like she's the hottest girl Dan knows. Okay, great, like fantastic /S. And then we have Jordan, who has kind of turned into the third wheel in this novel as of now. He seems level-headed enough. Again, he also has some family problems with his parents not understanding or accepting that he is gay. I do like Jordan as a character. He has had some great dialogue, but I don't know what his purpose is in this novel. I feel like he's a character so far that is being squandered. He's okay, the third character in what is a trio of characters. He's gay so far. Really, the only reason that I can see why he's gay is so that he's, number one, a male, but also not a romantic rival for Abby. Jordan and Dan's interaction is minimal to not so far. Really, he's just like Abby's friend that Dan tolerates and who he tolerates of Dan. I really hope that we get a lot more from Jordan in the near future, and more than just him being that third wheeler, that sidekick, because that's what it feels like right now. And finally, we have the character of Dan, who, again, to me, his character seems a bit shallow. He just wants to date Abby. I guess that's typical teenager stuff, but he's having these nightmares about Brookline, the asylum. Sometimes he has some visions. But I can't see any actual depth to his character. Who is Dan? What does Dan enjoy? What makes Dan angry? What makes Dan happy? Why does Dan like Abby other than because she's hot? I just feel like overall, as a protagonist, his character is a bit lacking. And really what I want from this novel going forward is that we see a bit more of character development. I want Abby to be more than just the girl in a novel, the romantic interest. I want Jordan to be more than just the third wheel in a trio cliche. I want Felix to start having more of a role because it seems like they're hinting at his involvement somehow in Brookline. And that could just be me, but he's always there when the asylum stuff comes up. When Dan's having his nightmare, Felix was watching. And Felix was the one who told Dan where the photographs were. So I'm really hoping for a bit more from that character. And I think we're going to get some more from Felix, but more importantly, I really hope we get something from Jordan, because right now, I don't know why Jordan is in this novel. So on the subject of Felix and photographs, let's start where we left off. We finished chapter 10 last time. And I apologize for the noise. I do live in the hood, and right now it's fireworks season, and everyone's either shooting their guns or blasting off fireworks. Anyways, we are starting on chapter 11. So where we left off is that Abby specifically wants to return back to the photographs. It seems that she has developed a strong attachment to the lobotomy child, and it's implied that she redrew this child's photograph. And of course, Jordan is the level-headed one, and that's kind of what I don't necessarily like about Jordan's character. Is he's being used as he's not his own character. He's just hey guys, he's just the balance to Abby, the counterbalance to Abby and Dan's personalities. He doesn't really have his own personality. Anyways, I will stop rambling. And they begin to suspect some supernatural shenanigans given the ghost email. So we will be going back down to the room with the photograph. Chapter number 11. It didn't take Jordan long to pick the lock this time. Once more into the breach, said Dan, trying to make a joke. No one responded. Idiot. It was as dusty and dark as Dan remembered. He shivered. With cold or excitement, he wasn't sure. Probably a bit of both. Despite having seen it only once before, they moved quickly through the reception area, retracing their previous path to the warden's office. Dan held the door open until everyone had stepped through. So where do we start? Jordan asked in a nervous whisper. I feel like there has to be more to the old wing, Dan said, which would mean that there's another door around here somewhere. He sincerely hoped that there was more, anyway. It seemed a bit extreme that people in town would want to tear down the whole building over a dusty reception room and messy office. But there was something else, too. A feeling that the asylum went deeper. Look for hidden doors, latches, anything, he said, squeezing between his friends. The beam from the flashlight he bought this time bounced along the floor and up the walls as he studied the filing cabinets and bookshelves. Abby drifted to the wall beside the desk and immediately found the picture of the little girl again. Jordan stood frozen as if he'd already seen enough. Dan ignored them and pressed ahead. He moved from one bookcase to the next, shining his light over the cracks between each one. Dust covered everything, shimmering up into the air at even the lightest disturbance. Going clockwise, Dan eventually ended up at a cluster of filing cabinets that lined the wall behind the warden's desk. The third cabinet in the bunch looked strangely clocked, as if it had been pulled out from the wall and pushed back again. But not all the way. This was it. He knew it. As if to confirm his suspicion, the pair of rusted, broken spectacles hung from a hook on the other side of the cabinet. He reached to touch them, then stopped. There were fingerprint streaks on the wall behind the glasses, like someone had hung them up with a bloody hand. Guys, I think I found something, he said, reaching around to the back of the cabinet and gripping the edge. He pulled, and the cabinet lurched half an inch forward, its metal feet screeching across the floor. What are you doing? Jordan hissed. Don't break anything. Let me help. Abby was at his side, gripping the front right edge of the cabinet and counting 1, 2, 3. They heaved, and the cabinet eased forward a foot, giving them a glimpse of an opening behind. No way, Abby breathed. A secret passage? Is this for real? How did you know to look here? The spectacles, Dan said, pointing to the hook and the glasses. Abby looked at the streak marks, shuddered, and then seemed to collect herself. Just a little farther, and I think we can squeeze through, she said matter-of-factly. Nope, no thank you, I am not going in there. Jordan shuffled a few steps backwards, holding his hands up as if in surrender. Suit yourself, I want to see where this leads. She motioned for Dan to help her out, and after one last moment of hesitation, Dan reached for the back of the cabinet and pulled. In 2 quick tugs, their way was clear. Use your flashlight, Dan, I can't see anything. He went through first, his heart pounding in his ears. This must have been a real doorway once, but it looks like someone tried to brick it off, Dan said as he and Abby crouched and walked through to the next room. Then who opened it back up? Bits of loose brick and walls scattered from Dan's shoes. Professor Reyes mentioned something about a senior seminar archiving this place. I'm guessing they needed to knock a hole in the wall to get access. The ceiling and walls opened up, and with a quick sweep of the flashlight, Dan determined they were in a second, smaller office, this one with nothing but 2 tan filing cabinets and a downward stairwell to the right. What's in there? Jordan called from the other side, making them both jump. Nothing much, Dan replied, nearing the cabinets. Little placards with A, D, A through D, E through I, and so on, down the alphabet were affixed to each drawer. Just patient records, I think. You can come through if you want. Jordan appeared from the narrow passage, his eyes wide and spooked. He noticed the dark stairwell and recoiled. Please tell me you are not thinking of going down there, Abs. We haven't even found anything yet, she replied, flashing her phone toward the strip. We haven't even found anything yet, she replied, flashing her phone toward the stairs. Feels cold. I bet it leads down to a whole lower level. Which is exactly why you shouldn't go. Have you seen even one horror movie? Jesus! I just want to see where it goes, she said. And the stairs don't look too bad. Gingerly, she put one foot on the top stair and transferred her weight to it. See? Sturdy enough. I'll go with you, Dan offered. Great, awesome. You two go into the abyss then. I'll just be here not getting axe murdered. Together, Dan and Abby carefully took the stairs down, testing each step before putting their full weight on it. Dan wanted to think it was romantic, the way they were watching out for each other, but it was a stretch, even before you considered the cold and moldy smell that grew stronger with every step. At last, the stairs ended abruptly, winding around into a narrow corridor. Step by step, they crept forward, the corridor pressing in on them, making Dan feel like he couldn't breathe. He wondered how claustrophobic it must have felt working down here, especially if you were trying to push a wheelchair or a gurney along this narrow hall. Doors began appearing on their left, and then their right, staggered every few yards or so. Abby drew up in front of one, flashing her light into the little slot of a window set in the door. God, she murmured, there's still stuff laying around. What kind of stuff? Let's see. Dan opened the door and inched inside, frightened of what they might find. He shined his flashlight into the darkness. Instantly, he felt sick. It was the room from his vision, right down to the operating table and the bloody shackles on the wall. How could he have seen a room he'd never been in? He felt shaky and weak and leaned against the door while Abby toured around the room with her tiny cell phone light. What's that on the table? She asked, pointing to the rusty stain on the white sheet. "Blood," said Dan. "How can you be so sure?" "I have no idea." "It's so sad in here." Abby looked up at the single window in the room with the bars across it, as if anyone could actually climb through a slit that small and that high. As low as they were, the window must just barely be above ground, if it led outside at all. As low as they were, the window must just barely be above ground, if it led outside at all. Did they really live like this? "This place would make anyone crazy," Dan said with a violent shudder. "Let's get out of here." He'd meant the basement altogether, but when Abby turned to lead them farther down the hallway, Dan didn't stop her. At last, the narrow corridor opened up into a kind of small rotunda, with two closed doors at the far end of the curve. Abby approached the left-hand door, shining her phone over it. "More offices?" she said. "I don't know. I thought the offices were all upstairs." Dan opened the left door, unlocked, and took a step into the room. It was a mess. The contents of 7 filing cabinets lay strewn across the floor. There were folders, papers, and handwritten notes heaped in waist-deep piles, like someone had been frantically looking for something and hadn't had time to clean up. Dan picked his way through the mess, going to a door on the opposite side of the room and peering in. He couldn't help smiling as he shined the flashlight into the next office. Jackpot. "What is this place?" Abby asked. "Maybe it's storage? I mean, there's stuff tossed everywhere." "No, come look." Dan pushed through to the next room, Abby close on his heels. His light fell over a desk, and behind it, a highly backed chair. This room was as neat as the previous one was messy. In fact, it was so marvelously eerily intact that a half-finished letter still lay on the desk, abandoned. The fountain pen had long ago bled its innards onto the paper. Dan leaned over the little visitor's chair to get a better look, but whatever had been written on the paper was now obscured by spilled ink. Damn it. He felt foolish for the depth of his disappointment. What had he expected to find? Something with a subject line, like those ghost emails? Also, on the desk was a small leather-bound folder. Dan picked it up and was about to look through it when Abby said, "Check this out, Dan." Dan slid the folder into his hoodie pocket and walked around the desk. There were a few photographs in freestanding frames lined up beside a green glass banker's lamp. Abby had one of them in her hands and now passed it to Dan. A row of nurses in clean aprons and masks all stood neatly posed, with the warden in his spectacles and coat seated in front. Every single one of them stared straight ahead except for the nurse at the far right. Her head was cocked unnaturally to the side as if her neck had been snapped just before the picture was taken. Taking a step back, Dan imagined the infamous Brookline warden sitting at this desk, adjusting his spectacles and poring over research or composing a letter. Maybe even this letter, the one stained with the spilled black ink. A second, less rusty pair of spectacles sat on the desk near the photos. Without really being aware of it, Dan reached for them. They felt brittle to the touch and icy, but he held on to them, turning them over until the lenses caught in the light and They felt brittle to the touch and icy, but he held on to them, turning them over until the lenses caught the light and shone behind their layer of dust. "Try them on, Dan." And so he did. They fit perfectly. He looked again at the photograph of the warden and the nurses, the photograph in which no one was smiling. The glass of the frame reflected his face back at him, overlaid on a photo. With a jolt, he realized that he looked like the warden. He tore off the glasses as though they had burned him. Then something struck him. He'd seen this man, the warden, before, twice, They should. They sure look jazzed to be there, Abby commented, but Dan barely heard her. Hey, guys! Guys! I found something up here. It was Jordan, his voice echoing down from the floor above, reaching them faintly across the stretch of corridor. Dan set the photo back where Abby had found it, going so far as to reposition the frame and the marks it had left in the dust. He felt that the last thing he should do was disturb a place like this. They hurried back down the hall and up the stairs, more confident now that they had made the trip once. Jordan was in the midst of searching through the alphabetized cabinets. With his cell phone tucked between his cheek and his shoulder, he was thumbing through the contents of the top drawer. It was full of yellowing index cards. There are a ton of files in here, he said. It must have every single one of the patients, and get this, every single one of them's criminally insane. Both Dan and Abby craned over his shoulder to see what he meant. Jordan pulled out one of the cards and they leaned in to study it. It was for a patient named Pickle Frank. It had his name, date of birth, and city of origin. There was a box marked DOA 3/13/1964. That must have meant date of admission. Surely a psych ward wouldn't treat patients who were dead on arrival. Below that box, there was a box marked DOA 3/13/1964. That must have meant date of admission. Surely a psych ward wouldn't treat patients who were dead on arrival. Below that box was another that gave Dan a chill. Homicidal. There were small check boxes for Y and for N. On this particular card, the Y had been checked. Yes, Frank Biddle had been a murderer. Under the recovered box was an N, for no, he had not recovered. Abby replaced the card and flipped through a few more. Every single one had a Y checked for homicidal. Every single one had an N in the recovered box. Look, this one burned down his own house with his family still inside, Abby said. They certainly didn't mention this in the admissions packet. Jordan reached for another of the cards, inspecting it closely. This guy killed 3 wives before he was caught and sent here. Dan's brain was racing. As Jordan and Abby pulled out more cards, he ducked under them and opened a middle drawer in the filing cabinet. Maybe he could find a card on Dennis Haimline, a card that might say what had ultimately happened to him. He flipped through the cards quickly. Gabler, Gentile, Gold. Here was H. Hall, Hart, Haimline. He reached out to pull it, and the hand gripped his shoulder. Got you, the voice said. Chapter number 12. Dan shouted in surprise. In the glare of the new flashlight, he couldn't see who had grabbed him. He thought his heart would burst. Hey, chill out. Someone's going to get hurt down here. It was Joe, the red-headed hall monitor from the orientation meeting. Shit. Dan felt a bead of sweat slip down his temple. A sign and big lock on the door weren't enough? How'd you get in here anyway? Come on out. It's not safe. There's water damage everywhere, not to mention the rats. Dan swallowed hard. There wasn't. We didn't. Didn't what? Think? Now come on, get out of here. Joe turned around and in a flash, Dan pulled out the index card on Dennis Haimline and shoved it into his pocket. Shit, Jordan groaned. I am so burned. I've got this, Abby whispered. Just follow my lead, okay? How could she be so calm? Dan's hands were shaking and he was full on sweating. This was not him. He was not a troublemaker. He was a reader, a studier, and a rule follower. Who was this person who broke off into offices and stole things? So I'm going to take a break right here from this chapter just to make one commentary again on characterization. Now, we just read the sentence, this was not him. He was not a troublemaker. He was a reader, a studier, and a rule follower. Now, I'm not sure if this is intentional or not, but it's not set up in this novel earlier on, is Dan to really be any of these things. It is mentioned, but of course, actions speak louder than words. One of the first things that Dan did upon arriving at Brookline was basically break into this place. We have much more evidence so far in this novel of Dan being a person who broke into offices and stole things than of him being a reader, a studier, and a rule follower. I understand. It would be boring just to read about Dan, the studier and the rule follower. But of course, if we're ending up at this point, I personally believe there should be a transition. There should be more evidence early on that he was this rule follower and reader, studier, and there should be that transitionatory period, and then we should end up here as the rule breaker. My issue is that he started off as a rule breaker, and that's kind of what I'm meaning about character development in progress. Anyways, I apologize for the intermission, and let's continue. I've got this, Abby whispered. Just follow my lead, okay? How could she be so calm? Dan's hands were shaking and he was full on sweating. This was not him. He was not a troublemaker. He was a reader, a studier, and a rule follower. Who was this person who broke into offices and stole things? Joe waited for them all to get through the passage in the wall, shining his flashlight directly at their feet. When Dan stood up on the other side, Abby looked like she was rubbing her eyes furiously, getting dust all over her face. Is she okay? Dan asked Jordan softly. Jordan shrugged. Joe motioned them all into the old reception area. As he corralled them back into the first-floor hallway, Dan frantically tried to think of a way to pretend this was all part of his classwork for Professor Reyes. Every excuse sounded more implausible than the last. Joe paused at the door to redo the padlock and said, okay, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to... Suddenly, Abby burst into tears. Jordan immediately put an arm around her and she collapsed against his side. We're so sorry, Joe, she sobbed, wiping her tear-stained face. Her tears left actual streaks down her dusty face. We didn't mean to break any rules. We were just so curious. Please, I'm so sorry. It was, in Dan's honest opinion, too theatrical. And Joe seemed to pick up on that too, rolling his eyes at her. But then Abby inhaled deeply and burst out with the rawest, most heartbreaking sob Dan had ever heard. Joe looked dismayed, and Dan could see his authority cracking before their eyes. Joe was thinking about what a monster he would be if he reported her. It'll be all right, Dan said softly, patting Abby's shoulder. It's going to be okay. For the love of, just don't do it again, all right? I mean it. Don't. Joe shined his flashlight into each of their faces in turn. Abby nodded furiously when the light was on her. Now get back to your rooms. Now. He marched off, muttering under his breath. Sweet Enola Gay, that was amazing, Jordan whispered when Joe was out of sight. Then he turned and pulled Abby into his arms, spinning her off her feet. An Oscar moment if there ever was one. Thanks, she said, using the back of her hand to wipe the last of the tears. Without another word, she set off for the stairs. That was too close. Close? Closer than close. We got caught, Dan said, feeling as if he was resurfacing from the murky depths of a swamp. And to think he'd been on a date with Abby just hours before. A nice, normal date. They reached Abby's door. "Geez, I need a shower," she said. She sounded like she wasn't even a little bit fazed. But a shower did sound great. Dan itched from the dust and dirt had settled over his skin, and the more he thought about it, the more it itched. He'd been clawing at his skin soon, but he wanted to talk to Abby one last time alone before he went back to his room. He looked at Jordan, trying to signal with his eyes that he wanted some privacy to say goodbye to Abby, dusty or all otherwise. "Okay, on that note," Jordan said breathlessly, "I need to go pray, a lot. I will pray to every freaking god there is in thanks that I did not just get my ass kicked out." Jordan trotted off up the stairs, one hand in his pocket, the other pulling out his trusty die. Dan heard him whistle a little song as he went, the tune floating up and up before fading away. When he was sure they were alone, Dan said, "I had a really great time tonight." Before the getting busted thing, obviously. "Yeah," Abby replied. Something was distracting her, though. Her eyes went to his shoulder, then to the floor, then finally to his eyes. "I had fun, too." "I'm sorry we got caught and that you had to cry, but you were amazing, really. We would have been in huge trouble without you." "It was nothing," she shrugged, and then said abruptly, "I'll see you in the morning, Dan, okay?" He nodded too fast, blowing whatever nonchalance he had hoped to project. "Yeah, of course. Sleep tight, Abby. Be a tree." They both laughed nervously and looked at their feet. Whatever had been between them earlier this evening, if there had been something between them, was gone. Of course, all things considered, how could it not be? "Well, good night." Abby gave him a quick wave and went into her room. A dust bunny hung like a burr in her hair. He should have brushed it away. So we will end this episode at this point. Just some commentary. Again, character. Hopefully we'll continue to see development. I didn't like the date scene, but I do like this more natural. Well, I guess it's not necessarily natural. What I suspect, if this were any type of basic film or cookie cutter novel, this is Dan and Abby's character arc. So they meet, they hit it off, they have a conflict and pull apart, and then they reunite. I suspect Abby is hiding something. She, just as Dan pulled out Dennis Hamline's folder, I'm sure Abby found something of her own, and that there is a reason why she is kind of pulling away at this point. One other thing, going all the way back to their date, I actually did not like that. I should have mentioned this in the last episode. I did not like that chapter too much, mainly because basically this is setting up a plot point disguised as a date. This wasn't really a date. All they did was go and talk about his email. In his email, first thing in chapter 9, he got the email. And basically that entire date was talking about it. It just seems, again, the whole concept of expedited and very scripted. It does not feel natural. It's not bad. Again, it is an easy read. But I would like a bit more character development. And I feel like just how expedited this novel is. Okay, thing A happens, thing B happens to make sure that thing C, plot point C will happen. Really takes away from some of the character development. It doesn't feel, this is not, and maybe this is my personal preference, this is not a character-driven novel. This is more of a very plot-driven novel with kind of characters thrown in there. And I feel terrible saying this, it is actually a good read, and I do enjoy reading it, but more than a living story, it does feel like kind of like an assembly line almost of information being thrown at you. And again, I always sound so negative with this one, and I feel bad because it's our first one, but let's end it there. Hopefully chapter number 13, we will continue to see some progression with character. Hopefully Abby turns out to be more than just a hot girl who can cry and get them out of trouble. Hopefully Jordan will become more than just a third wheel. Hopefully we will see more to Dan, more personality to Dan other than wanting to investigate Brookline's past and wanting to develop a relationship with Abby. And on that note, I will end this episode. Thank you as always for tuning in, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.